When a German Shepherd refuses to approach a tree, you listen. John Carter did and found a hidden past stitched into the bark itself. Each cut of his knife unearthed not only bones, but the truth about men sworn to protect the town. Who can you trust when the law itself is guilty? Don't miss the story, like, comment, and subscribe for more. The morning in Pine Hollow came on like a held breath. A soft silver hush laid over the valley and the timberline. John Carter stepped off his porch with his coffee cooling in a dented steel mug and the leash draped loose in his hand out of habit more than need. Max didn't much care for leashes. He stayed where John stayed. 80 pounds of German Shepherd, all sinew and attention. He moved like he'd been poured from the same mold as the land, quiet, sure alert to every small sound that might matter. Their route rarely changed down the gravel drive past the mailbox dented by winter plows across the ditch where the cattails bowed in the slightest wind up the shallow rise to the north fence line where the old oak watched over two properties like a veteran standing a last post. John liked that tree for reasons he couldn't always explain. People in town said it had seen wagon wheels and boot spurs and the first power lines. Its branches had the reach of a great-grandfather's arms. If he had a creed anymore, it was simple. Keep moving, keep quiet, keep faith with what you know. He had traded the city's sirens for this rustle and quiet years back when a gold watch and a handshake told him his days of knock and talk were over. The only thing that still woke him before dawn was the echo of old calls he could not unhear, and on better days the promise of Max's eager trot to the door. Max led him down the drive, as always, nose sampling the cold air like a reader touching the spine of a book. A raven arrowed across the pale sky and cried once the note breaking as if it hit the chill and scattered. Frost had feathered the ditch grass in white. John set the mug on the fence post and slipped his hands into the pockets of a chore jacket frayed at the cuffs. He talked to Max the way he'd once talked to partners, steady, without heat, more to mark the living than to fill the silence. Easy boy, same loop. Max's ears twitched at his name. He trotted ahead to the rise, then stopped so abruptly that gravel skittered under his pads. The big shepherd lowered his head, hackles faintly, lifting, and he gave a short clipped bark that John had heard only a handful of times. Rare notes reserved for things that were not right. Not deer. Not a stray coyote. Something else. John slowed, not wanting to push the dog past the comfort line, and studied the space ahead like he would a room before crossing a doorframe. The old oak held the edge of the property where the wire fence bent around a glacial boulder. Its trunk was the color of old coffee, ridged and grooved, the bark stacked like bookshelves. Max refused to go closer. He planted his front paws and leaned back slightly, eyes locked. Ears pricked that odd bark again, 1-2 pause, then a quiet rumble that lived low in his chest. "What do you see?" John asked. Voice low. He didn't move his shoulders. He was careful with the space around a wary dog. Max glanced at him and back to the tree, and then he did something that cut through John's calm like a blade. He retreated 2 steps and circled to John's left hip, edging his body partly in front of the man, a protective placement he had used only when a stranger came up on them too fast in town. The shepherd wasn't spooked. He was choosing a position. John felt his own pulse answer. He'd learned long ago that you pay attention when a partner talks, whether the partner speaks in words or in muscle. He left the leash clipped to the loop on his belt, and walked forward alone, slow enough for Max to adjust if he wanted to. The cold bit the tip of his nose, and the air tasted like pine and last night's wood smoke. At 20 feet he saw it, the first wrongness. The south face of the oak wore a set of fresh scars. Not beetlework, not the healed lightning rake that angled high above. These cuts were blunt and impatient, a tool pushed where it didn't belong. The bark had been shaved in thumb-wide strips and chipped with shallow gouges at irregular angles, the kind made by someone working from a ladder or bracing a boot against the trunk. The pale inner cambium showed in a shape like a question pressed into skin. He stopped again and let his eyes do the slow work. A year on a desk had taught him to read paper. 30 years on streets and back lots had taught him to read surfaces, what people touched, how they left their mark. The ground at the base told a second part of the story. Disturbed not much, but enough. The leaf litter lay wrong, a scatter of oak leaves turned dark, side up, like cards in a hurry. There were wood curls too clean to be old. He squatted balanced on the balls of his feet and touched a shaving. Damp, still pliant. These cuts couldn't be more than a few days, maybe hours. The morning was so quiet he could hear Max's breathing. John turned his head to reassure the dog without breaking sightline on the trunk. "It's all right. I see it." The words were for both of them. He took off his glove and pressed 2 fingers against an uncut section of bark. The oak's skin felt cold and steady. He looked for reasons that weren't reasons, kids from the Miller place fooling around a hunter doing something foolish. A storm-peeled branch knocked loose. None of those fit the angles. Someone had worked at this tree with purpose, and then stopped. Max edged forward a hair nose, testing the breeze, then froze again. John noticed the shepherd's focus shift by degrees, not just on the trunk, but on a particular band of scars about shoulder height on a tall man. The pattern there narrowed into a trough, like a pry had been levered and abandoned. He reached into his jacket and thumbed the old pocket knife he carried since his father, a lineman, had pressed it into his palm the day he graduated the academy. He didn't open it. Not yet. He stood again, not wanting to cut what he didn't understand, and walked a slow half-circle to see the other side. The north face looked untouched. The bark there furred with lichen and calm with time. The fence wire sang a little where frost contracted it, the sound so faint it felt imagined. Max moved with him, matching the arc body close enough that John could feel the warmth through denim when their legs brushed. "You're telling me we don't cross," John said. The dog's tail hung still, not tucked. Alert, not afraid. That mattered. He kept scanning. There were no ladder impressions in the soil, too much leaf cover for prints to hold, but he saw one scuff on the boulder, chalky and new, as if a heel had slid there in the last rain and left a smear. He pictured a boot braced on stone, a shoulder jammed against the trunk, the stink of sweat and impatience, and the sharp, quick sound of metal biting wood. The picture made his jaw work and his mouth go dry. He didn't like strangers near his fence line, but this wasn't about trespass. This was about intent. The morning had begun with coffee and a plan for trimming the shed door. It had turned into a small, quiet field exam, and the sensation slid John back into an old posture that never fully left. Shoulders square without tension, breathing slow and deep to widen the field of sight. He listened. Far off, a pickup coughed to life and settled into a distant idle. A dog barked and stopped. A hawk made a long circle over the pasture, the kind of patient arc a man makes when he's got work, but no reason to hurry. John took one step closer to the scars. He saw a thin, fresh curl of bark still clinging like a hangnail, bright at the edge. He could have flicked it free. He did not. There is a line between seeing and disturbing. He had lectured rookies on it to the point of boredom. You only cross that line when you're ready to own what comes with it. Max's paw touched his boot, a gentle tap that felt like a hand on a sleeve. The shepherd made a small sound in his throat and then looked left down the fence row the way a partner glances at a secondary door. John nodded without meaning to. He waited the count of 5 to let his blood settle and to listen for anything that might rise from the brush. The only answer was the dry talk of leaves and the drip-drip of thawed frost slipping from twig to twig. "We mark, we leave. We think," he said, quietly. He stepped back, memorizing the position of the scars in relation to the fence staple, and the notch in the boulder points he could relay later without photographs if he had to. He retrieved his mug from the post, the coffee now bitter cold, and took a sip anyway, the taste anchoring him. Max's ears stayed up all the way back to the porch. Twice the dog stopped, looked over his shoulder, and returned to John's side as if taking a final head count before leaving a scene. On the steps, John ruffled the shepherd's neck and felt the thick ruff warm under his fingers. Max closed his eyes at the touch and leaned in for half a breath, then turned back to the yard still working. The sun finally broke the ridge and painted the oak in a thin, pale blade of light. Even from the porch, the fresh wounds on the trunk stood out like chalk marks on a blackboard. He felt a pull to go back down, to dig, to pry, to turn suspicion into fact. But he had learned in a hard school that patience does not lose evidence. It keeps you alive long enough to tell someone what you found. He set the mug against the rail and let his hand rest on Max's shoulder until the dog's breathing matched his own. In the reflection of the window glass, he could see the shape of the old oak watching the fence line, and beyond that, the first slow stirrings of a town that believed it knew all its secrets. He told himself that maybe damage was just damage. He knew better. He had seen this kind of wrongness in alley doors and apartment locks, and the faces of men who looked away at the question that mattered most. Something had happened at that tree. Max had felt it first. John had seen enough to know he would not be sleeping hard tonight. He would return, and when he did, he would bring more than a pocket knife and a coffee mug. For the moment, he stood with the dog who would not pass the oak and watched the light lift a fraction higher like a curtain beginning to rise. John Carter did not return to the oak until the afternoon when the sun had moved westward and the shadows of the tree line had lengthened into long fingers across his field. The memory of Max's refusal to cross and the sight of the fresh scars on the trunk kept working in his mind as though it were a case file left open on a desk waiting for an answer. He had lived enough years to know that ignoring a problem never made it vanish, only harder to solve later. So he left his jacket zipped against the cool wind called Max to his side and walked the fence line once more. The oak loomed as it always had, but the closer he came, the more he felt the weight of that morning pressing down again. Max stopped a few paces short of the trunk, ears pricked forward, body tense, tail stiff at half-mast. John spoke softly, reassuring, but the dog's focus never shifted. He studied the trunk again, his eyes trained to read small signs, and saw what he had missed before. Along the fresh gouges where the bark had been sliced, dark sap had begun to seep thick and slow, collecting in droplets that gleamed faintly. He leaned closer, careful not to touch, and drew in a breath through his nose. At once he regretted it. The odor was not the clean sweetness of pine resin, nor the sharp tang of oak pitch he remembered from woodwork. It carried a metallic edge, sour and rancid, with a note that brought back the memory of early years in uniform when he had first walked through rooms where violence had taken its toll. The smell was too close to old blood clotted and settled into fabric. John steadied himself, forcing the breath out slowly while Max gave a low rumble, eyes never leaving the scarred trunk. John knew scent meant more to a dog than sight. If it unsettled him, it must have been sharper still to Max. He shifted his gaze downward, scanning the base of the tree where roots jutted like ribs from the earth. The ground looked unsettled, though the litter of leaves disguised it. Max suddenly moved forward despite his earlier hesitation, pressing his nose into the soil near one thick root. The shepherd pawed once-twice, then began to dig with determination. John crouched beside him, brushing aside leaves and loose soil with his gloved hand to keep pace. Within a minute, Max's claws caught on something that did not belong to earth. A strip of cloth emerged damp and discolored, but undeniably human-made. John tugged gently, pulling it free from the soil. It came loose with a reluctant sound coated in damp dirt. He held it up, shook off the clinging soil, and saw its true nature. The cloth was no weathered remnant of an old pioneer sack or tarpaulin, but modern fabric synthetic weave, part of a shirt or jacket, no older than a decade. The color had dulled to gray-brown, but faint stitching at the hem still showed machine work. Max sniffed it, then sneezed, pulling back as though the scent carried something foul. John turned the fabric over in his hands, eyes narrowing. The edges were torn, not cut clean. The soil had preserved the fibers more than the sun would have, meaning it had not lain long in the open before being buried. He considered who might have left it and why it would end up pressed between roots of a century-old oak. Nothing about it suggested the innocence of trash or lost clothing. It felt intentional. He slipped the cloth into a plastic evidence bag he carried in the pocket of his jacket, a habit from old days that he never abandoned even after retirement. He sealed it tight, not knowing yet if it was evidence of a crime or a puzzle piece from some forgotten accident, but certain enough it did not belong there. He looked back at the sap bleeding down the trunk, thick and unnatural, catching light in a way that turned it black against the bark. The odor hung around him, metallic and insistent. Max gave another low growl, then turned sharply toward the woods, nose high, testing the air. John followed his gaze but saw nothing except the layered shadows of branches and the long grass moving under the wind. He stood slowly, his knees creaking, and kept the bagged cloth in one hand, knife in the other. Instinct pressed against the back of his mind, whispering that nothing here was random. First the scars, now the stench, then the fabric dragged from the roots by Max. 3 signs, connected or not pointed to deliberate disturbance. He walked the perimeter of the tree slowly, Max glued to his side, now head swinging back and forth. The dog pressed closer at intervals, nudging his thigh as though to say, "Do not forget, I am here." He studied each angle of the bark and roots, each break in the soil, each fragment of leaf disturbed. He tried to imagine who would bring something here to hide it and what they were trying to bury. The oak was no ordinary tree. It was too exposed to be chosen by chance, too large to be mistaken for anything else. If someone meant to hide, they had hidden in plain sight, trusting the bulk of the trunk and the slow cover of time to conceal the truth. The thought chilled him, and he clenched his jaw against the cold air that cut deeper as the light faded. Max barked suddenly, one sharp note that cracked across the quiet like a warning shot. John's head snapped toward the sound eyes, sweeping the field again. Nothing moved except the restless wind. Still, he felt the prickle on the back of his neck that told him they were not alone. He placed his hand firmly on Max's shoulder, steadying them both. "We're done for now," he said quietly, though his tone carried more to himself than to the dog. He turned toward home, his boots crunching against gravel, the cloth sealed in his pocket, the sap smell clinging to him like a memory he could not shake. Max walked pressed tight against his side ears, swiveling as though expecting pursuit. By the time they reached the porch, twilight had folded over the valley. John glanced back once. In the dim light, the oak's scars looked darker than bark, and he could still smell the rancid sap on his gloves, though he had not touched it. He set the cloth bag on the counter inside and washed his hands, but the water did little to erase the thought that the tree held more than bark and sap. Something had been forced into its heart, and Max had felt it first. The shepherd sat by the door, still watching the field eyes reflecting the last thin strip of daylight. John Carter could not leave the discovery of the stained cloth to rest. That evening he sat at his kitchen table staring at the plastic bag on the counter, while Max lay at his feet with his head resting on his paws, ears twitching at every faint sound from outside. The smell of the sap still haunted John's nose, clinging like an unwelcome memory, and he knew he would not sleep until he understood more about what the oak was hiding. The retired detective inside him, the part of his life he thought he had put away, had been stirred awake by the strange fabric and the sickening odor, and once that part of him stirred, it demanded answers. He poured himself black coffee instead of whiskey and buttoned his jacket again, whistling softly for Max. The shepherd rose at once, ready, as if he too felt the pull back toward the tree. They crossed the yard in near darkness, guided by the lantern John carried in one hand and the quiet certainty in his chest that something waited at the old oak. The night air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of earth after frost. Max kept close, his shoulder brushing John's leg as if to share reassurance. The oak loomed ahead like a sentry carved against the sky, its crown dark and still, but its scarred trunk seeming almost to breathe in the flicker of lantern light. John set the lantern at the base and pulled out the pocket knife that had traveled with him through every stage of his life, from rookie patrol to homicide detective, a tool that had always found its way into evidence boxes and witness statements alike. He flicked the blade open with practiced ease and pressed it gently into one of the gashes that already marred the trunk. The wood yielded with a faint creak, and the bark split just enough to show something that did not belong. A thin edge of plastic black and weathered peeked through the wound in the tree. John's breath caught in his throat, for plastic was no natural growth, no product of time or weather. He steadied his hand and pressed further, peeling back a strip of bark that cracked reluctantly, as if the oak itself was reluctant to surrender its secret. Max whined low, pacing beside him, eyes fixed on the exposed material. John worked the blade with care, widening the opening inch by inch until the shape of a crumpled sheet of nylon became clear, wedged deep within the trunk as though the tree had grown around it for years. The plastic crackled faintly under the knife's edge, brittle with age, edges softened by time yet still holding form. He pinched it between two fingers and pulled gently. The sheet resisted, caught in the embrace of living wood, and then gave way with a sound like tearing cloth, revealing what lay behind. The lantern's glow caught a pale curve inside, smooth against the rough cavity. For an instant he thought it was stone, but his eyes adjusted, and the truth struck him cold. It was bone unmistakably human pressed into the hollow where the nylon had once wrapped it, now trapped as the oak had thickened and grown around it through the years. John's breath came shallow, the silence around him broken only by Max's low growl. He reached further, his fingers brushing against the curved surface, and felt the unmistakable hardness of a rib or long bone. It carried the texture of something that had been there for many years, neither fresh nor entirely decayed, simply held fast by the slow, unrelenting growth of the tree. The thought made his skin prickle. He withdrew his hand quickly, wiped it against his jacket, and stared at the cavity. The oak had not merely been marked by careless hands. It had become the guardian of a grave. Max barked once sharp, as if demanding his master recognize the truth fully. John nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. The dog's instincts had been right all along. He took a long step back, holding the knife steady, and scanned the tree line beyond the oak. The woods lay still, but he felt the weight of unseen eyes as he had earlier. Whoever had hidden a body inside this tree had counted on time, weather, and silence to erase the evidence. But Max had pulled the first thread loose, and now the fabric of secrecy was unraveling. John turned back to the oak, studying the plastic that still clung to splinters within the cavity. Bits of cloth fibers clung there too, interwoven with bark, as though the tree itself had tried to absorb everything foreign forced into it. He felt anger stir beneath his ribs, not hot, but steady, the kind that had once kept him on cases when others grew tired. Someone had placed a human being in this tree, and if the remains belonged to Daniel Miller, whose initials he had already seen on the keychain, then a crime had gone unnoticed or unacknowledged for a decade. He reached for the evidence bag in his pocket and slipped in a small fragment of the nylon that broke free, sealing it tight. Max circled the tree nose down, sniffing every root, every scar, as though he too wanted to ensure no detail escaped them. The shepherd returned to John's side with a look that seemed almost human, amber eyes filled with a question. What now, John? Sheathed his knife, retrieved the lantern, and whispered, "Now we keep going, boy. We don't stop until we know." They walked back slowly, the oak behind them darker than ever, its secret finally exposed to someone unwilling to look away. As John closed the cabin door behind them, he felt both fear and resolve, a recognition that the discovery was no accident. It had waited years to be found, and Max had been the one to sound the alarm. John poured himself another coffee. Though the hour was late, sat at the table again and began to write notes in a lined notebook, recording details as carefully as if he were back on the force. Outside, the wind rose in the pines, and the old oak swayed with a creak like a warning. John Carter could not shake the image of the nylon and the pale curve of bone locked in the oak's trunk. Sleep came in fits, and every time he drifted into slumber, he saw the hollow again, saw the bark split like torn skin, saw the fragment of a life wedged where no life should rest. By dawn, he knew there would be no peace until he returned to collect more. The lawman inside him refused to stop at half a truth. He prepared carefully, taking not only his knife and lantern, but a pair of heavy gloves and a second set of evidence bags. Max followed him without hesitation, ears already alert, as though he knew the work was not yet done. The oak stood under a gray sky that threatened rain. John placed the lantern against the base roots, the yellow glow making the scars look deeper, and set his jaw before slipping the blade into the cavity he had opened the night before. The wood creaked again, and flakes of bark tumbled down like brittle scabs. He worked slowly, widening the opening by inches until he could see more of the nylon pressed inside. With steady pressure, he pried another fragment loose, and behind it, more bone appeared, this time unmistakably the rounded head of a femur locked at an angle. His stomach clenched, but he forced his breath to stay even. He reached carefully with gloved fingers, shifting aside fragments of bark, and something small tumbled free into the hollow of his palm. At first it was nothing but a rusted piece of metal, rough with corrosion, but when he rubbed it against his glove, a shape emerged, a keychain. The ring had fused together with rust, but the small tag hanging from it still bore faintly etched letters. He turned it under the lantern light, and his chest tightened. The initials read DM. John's throat constricted as recognition struck. Daniel Miller had lived half a mile down the ridge, a rancher who had vanished 10 years earlier. The search parties had scoured the fields. The county sheriff had dragged the river, and neighbors had whispered theories ranging from a hunting accident to a man simply walking away from his debts. But John had never believed Daniel would have left his land, his cattle, and his family. And now the initials in his hand confirmed what his instincts had suggested all along. Daniel had not left Pine Hollow. He had been left inside this tree. Max let out a sudden growl, low and steady, pulling John out of his thoughts. The shepherd's body stiffened, ears high gaze, locked not on the oak but beyond it into the forest. John froze his hand, tightening on the keychain. He followed the dog's gaze, straining to see into the shadows between trunks. The forest lay quiet, but something in the silence felt wrong. The kind of wrongness that comes when silence itself has weight. Max barked once, sharp and commanding, his body leaning forward with every muscle primed. John knew that bark. It was no longer the uncertain alarm of earlier. This was a warning to an intruder, a demand to reveal themselves. His pulse quickened, and his eyes combed the darkness, yet he saw nothing but shifting branches. Still, the feeling of being watched crawled across his skin. Whoever had buried Daniel in this tree, if they were still alive, might not have left their secret unguarded. He slipped the keychain into a bag, sealed it, and tucked it inside his jacket. His knife stayed ready in his palm, though he knew full well a blade was little against distance. Max advanced 2 steps toward the tree line, barking again, his voice echoing through the valley, scattering a raven from a high branch. The bird's cry broke the silence, but still no figure emerged. John scanned every shadow, every patch of brush, memorizing lines in case movement betrayed them later. He trusted Max's senses more than his own. If the dog said eyes were out there, then eyes were out there. He pressed a hand gently to Max's shoulder, grounding the shepherd and himself. "Not now, boy." He murmured, his tone steady but edged with urgency. He pulled the lantern close and shut the blade of his knife, choosing to retreat with evidence in hand rather than push for a confrontation in the open. Together, they backed away from the oak step by step, never turning their backs fully on the woods. John could feel the unseen gaze following heavy as a hand between his shoulder blades. Only when they reached the porch and shut the cabin door did Max finally quiet, though his body remained tense, his eyes still flicking toward the window. John set the evidence bag with the keychain beside the one that held the cloth and nylon, his mind racing. He now had proof that the tree concealed human remains and a personal link to a man he had known. But the greater danger was clear someone was aware of his discovery and had chosen to watch rather than stop him, at least for now. He poured water into Max's dish, set it down, and crouched to run a hand along the shepherd's back. Max's ears twitched, but his gaze never softened. He was still guarding, still listening. John whispered, "You saw them, didn't you? Whoever put Daniel here, they're still out there." He straightened, sat heavily at the kitchen table, and began to write again in his notebook, the page filling with dates, initials, observations, each word a chain pulling him back into the man he once was. He knew the next step would not be easy, for secrets guarded this long were rarely surrendered without resistance. And whoever had stood in the shadows tonight had no intention of letting the truth come quietly. John Carter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the bagged keychain while Max remained at the door, head low and ears pricked as if still tuned to the forest. The coffee in John's cup had gone cold, but he did not bother reheating it. His thoughts circled relentlessly around Daniel Miller's initials, the bone locked in the tree, and the feeling of unseen eyes watching. He was scribbling notes when the crunch of tires on gravel reached his ears. Max leapt to his feet, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest body pressed to the window. John's cabin sat 5 miles from town on a road seldom used, and visitors rarely came without calling first. He rose slowly, heart thudding in his ribs, and peered through the curtain. A patrol car rolled into view, its headlights cutting across the yard before the engine quieted. The sight of the sheriff's star on the side panel sent a ripple of unease through him. Within moments, Deputy Roy Jackson stepped out, adjusting his hat as if he had all the time in the world. Roy had been with the county force for nearly 15 years and had always treated John with the polite respect due a retired detective. They had shared coffee at diners, traded small talk at the feed store. Yet something about the timing of his arrival gnawed at John. Roy waved casually and called out, "Afternoon, John. Got a report about some noise out here, something like a chainsaw. Thought I'd check in." John opened the door slowly. Max braced against his leg, the shepherd's growl steady now. He answered, "Chainsaw. Out here? That's strange, Roy. No one close enough to hear anything from my place." Roy smiled, but it did not quite reach his eyes. "Well, you know how calls come in. Figured I'd better check, make sure you and the property are all right." John studied him, the years of interrogation rooms returning in force. His mind picked apart the deputy's words. No one lived within 3 miles who could have reported such a sound, and he had not touched a saw, only his knife at the oak. The excuse did not fit. Max growled louder, the sound rolling like thunder in his throat. What made John's skin prickle was that Max had never shown hostility toward Roy before. The shepherd had tolerated the deputy's visits, even allowed him to pat his head. Now the dog stood rigid, teeth barely bared, eyes locked on Roy as if he were an intruder. Roy took a slow step closer, his boots crunching on gravel. "Mind if I look around?" he asked casually, hand resting near his belt. "Just protocol, you understand." John kept his voice steady, though his instincts were screaming. "What exactly are you hoping to find, Roy? I was just here with Max. No chainsaw, no noise except the wind in the trees." Roy shrugged, but his eyes flicked past John's shoulder toward the direction of the oak. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but John saw it. Years on the job had trained him to catch the smallest, tells the glance that betrayed a thought unspoken. Max's growl deepened into a bark, sharp and explosive, making Roy pause. The shepherd advanced a step, hackles bristling, and John placed a firm hand on his collar, though he did not pull him back. The dog's instincts had already proven sharper than his own, and he was not about to dismiss them now. Roy raised both palms in a show of peace. "Easy there, Max. Didn't mean to upset him. He must be sensing my nerves, that's all." John studied him in silence. He could not accuse without proof, but every sign pointed to more than coincidence. An anonymous report of chainsaw noise, an unnecessary welfare check, and a deputy appearing less than an hour after John uncovered the keychain. Too much aligned, too neatly. "I'll walk the yard myself," John said finally. "If you've got forms to fill, you'll have to do it without my help. You can tell whoever called in that everything here is fine." Roy's smile thinned, but he gave a short nod. "All right, John. Just doing my job. You take care of yourself." He lingered a heartbeat too long before turning back to his patrol car. Max barked again, sharper this time, and did not quiet until the car rolled down the drive and disappeared into the trees. John shut the door, knelt beside Max, and stroked his head. The dog's body still vibrated with tension, every sense alive. "You don't trust him anymore," John whispered. "Neither do I." He returned to the table, his notebook open before him. He added a new line under Daniel Miller's name. "Deputy Roy Jackson. First on scene excuse doesn't hold Max hostile reaction." He tapped the pen against the page, the pieces beginning to connect in ways that made his chest heavy. The tree held more than bark and bone. It held a truth someone wanted kept buried. And Roy's sudden visit confirmed that John and Max were no longer simply uncovering the past. They were being watched, measured, and tested. Outside, the wind rose again, and the old oak swayed in the distance, the scars on its trunk hidden by dusk but not forgotten. John Carter could not let Roy Jackson's unexpected visit keep him from pushing deeper into the oak's secret. The timing of the deputy's arrival had confirmed that someone knew exactly how close John and Max were to the truth. That night, long after the patrol car's taillights had disappeared, John sat awake at the table, the lantern glowing low, his notes spread before him. He thought about the bones, the keychain, the fabric, and Roy's excuse about a chainsaw. He thought of Daniel Miller's widow, who had waited 10 years for an answer that never came. His conscience told him that silence now would be complicity. So before dawn broke, he strapped on his boots, grabbed heavier tools, and returned to the oak with Max trotting at his side. The air smelled of wet leaves, and the bark's scar still looked raw in the pale morning light. Max circled restlessly, nose down, ears flicking at every small sound. John set the lantern on the root flare, slipped on gloves, and slid his knife into the cavity again. The nylon tore, further yielding to his persistence, and something new shifted inside. He eased out a package wrapped in oilcloth sticky with sap, the paper cracking as he lifted it into the open. The bundle felt stiff edges squared. He peeled back a corner carefully, and a chill ran through him. Inside lay photographs, dozens of them protected from decay by the waxy paper. He flipped through the first few, the beam of his lantern cutting across familiar faces. There was Sheriff Robert Hale shaking hands at a county fair. There was Councilman Alan Griggs beside a campaign sign. There was Roy Jackson himself, younger, standing with other deputies at what looked like a secluded clearing. Each image showed men John had once trusted, men who had spoken of duty and service, captured together in settings that had no business being photographed. These were not official events, not family gatherings. The composition was wrong. The men stood in groups too deliberate, the backgrounds too remote, the faces too careful. John's hand trembled as he turned page after page. The oilcloth had preserved not only the photos, but also their implication. These men were tied together in something secret, something worth hiding in the body of a tree. Max whined and scratched at the soil beside a root, pulling John's attention down. The shepherd's claws caught on something hard beneath the leaves and dirt. John crouched, brushing the soil away, and soon Max had exposed the corner of a small tin box, rusted but intact. John lifted it free, feeling its unexpected weight. He pried it open with his knife, the hinges groaning. Inside lay a handgun wrapped in a rag gone stiff with age. He pulled the weapon free, turning it under the light. It was a .38. Revolver, its steel darkened with rust, but what struck him most was the filed-down space where the serial number should have been. Whoever placed this weapon here had wanted it to vanish from records, yet they had not destroyed it, only hidden it. He turned it over, recognizing the model as standard issue to law enforcement years earlier. His chest tightened. A service weapon erased from the books buried with photos of officials and a neighbor's bones. Max pawed at the ground again, restless, his body language tense as though the scent rising from the soil pressed against instincts too deep to ignore. John sealed the gun in a fresh bag, slipped the bundle of photographs into another, and pressed both into his jacket. His mind reeled with the connections. A missing neighbor, a deputy with excuses, a chief who appeared in photos among men who should not have gathered, and a weapon filed smooth as if it had been both used and erased. He stood slowly, scanning the woods again, his free hand resting gently on Max's back. The shepherd leaned into him, gaze fixed outward, ready for the first sign of threat. John whispered, "You were right again, boy. The truth runs deeper than bark." He extinguished the lantern, choosing to retreat before daylight drew more attention. Back at the cabin, he spread the photographs on the table, his stomach twisting at each face. These were men who had spoken at his retirement, who had shaken his hand and thanked him for his years of service. Now their images stared back at him from a hidden bundle buried with bones. Max paced near the window, ears tilting toward the forest. John loaded the revolver rust and all set it within reach and closed his notebook. The evidence had grown heavy, but the questions heavier still. He knew the oak had more to reveal, and with each step closer to the truth, the danger circling them thickened like the trees outside. The photographs and the revolver lay spread across John Carter's kitchen table, each item a heavy stone on his chest. He sat with a pencil in hand, writing notes in block letters, forcing himself to document details he could not trust to memory alone. Max paced the cabin like a sentinel, occasionally pausing to press his nose to the window pane before resuming his restless patrol. The shepherd's unease seeped into John's bones, reminding him that the oak's secret had already stirred attention, and the arrival of Deputy Roy Jackson had only been the first ripple. The hours ticked by, the lantern burning low until the cabin sank into silence, broken only by Max's claws clicking softly on the floorboards. Then came the sound, faint at first, then growing the crunch of gravel on the distant road. John stiffened his hand, sliding toward the revolver resting on the table. Max froze, ears snapping upright, his body locked toward the window. Through the thin curtain, beams of headlights cut across the trees, sweeping and then settling at the far edge of his land. The vehicle did not approach the cabin. Instead, it idled at the border of the property, the glow of its lamps spilling like pale fire through the dark. John's breath slowed, every sense sharpened by memory of nights spent waiting in alleys for suspects to reveal themselves. Whoever sat in that car was not lost. They were watching. Max's growl began low and steady, rolling into the stillness like thunder over hills. The shepherd stood with his front paws braced against the windowsill, chest rumbling as his amber eyes locked onto the lights. The vehicle lingered too long for coincidence. Then slowly the beams shifted, sweeping away as the car reversed down the road and disappeared into the night. The gravel's crunch faded, leaving behind only Max's growl tapering into silence. John stayed at the window long after the lights were gone, his jaw tight. The message was clear. He and Max were not only being watched, they were being warned. He drew the curtain shut, turned off the lantern, and sat against the wall with the revolver in hand, waiting until dawn broke across the horizon. When morning came, he moved through the motions of feeding Max and brewing coffee, though his stomach rejected the thought of food. The air outside felt sharper, as if the forest itself held its breath. He walked with Max back to the oak, each step weighted with unease. The scars on the trunk appeared at first as he remembered deep, raw, and strange. But when he drew closer, his stomach dropped. New wounds marked the bark-wide axe strokes hacked into the wood during the night. Fresh chips of oak lay scattered at the base, pale and clean against the dark earth. The intruder had not simply watched from the car. They had returned in darkness to silence the evidence locked within the tree. John crouched, touching one of the chips. The wood was damp, but not yet weathered, confirming the cuts were hours old. He looked at Max, who stood bristling at the base of the trunk, nose twitching at the disturbed soil. The shepherd pawed once, then growled his body language, warning that whoever had wielded the axe could return at any moment. John's straightened eyes narrowing. The attackers had not managed to remove the contents yet, but their intention was clear: destroy what the oak still guarded before it could be used against them. He scanned the tree line, imagining the shadows where men could have waited. The sound of steel biting wood muffled by distance. The glint of headlights kept just far enough to monitor his cabin. He had faced threats in alleys and tenements, but this felt heavier. This was his land, his home, his last refuge. The attack on the tree was no longer just about hiding Daniel Miller's death. It was an assault on the very ground he and Max had defended together. He photographed the fresh axe marks with his phone, careful to capture scale and detail. He then pressed his palm against Max's flank, feeling the dog's muscles quivering with alertness. "They came here knowing we'd find more," he murmured. "They'll keep coming until we stop them." Max barked once, a short, fierce note that cracked the quiet morning. John pocketed his phone, adjusted his jacket, and began gathering the scattered wood chips into a bag. Every fragment was evidence, every scar a testament. But as he worked, his eyes kept drifting to the forest's edge, where silence lingered too heavy, as though it concealed not just trees, but intent. He knew the game had shifted. The Watchers had revealed themselves not by face, but by act. They would not stop at wood. The morning after discovering the fresh axe marks, John Carter moved like a man carrying stones in his chest. He cataloged the new evidence, labeling bags with care, though each note he wrote felt heavier than the last. Max stayed close, shadowing him from room to room, body taut with an unease that never softened. John had learned to trust that tension as much as his own instincts. By late afternoon, a knock came at the cabin door. John froze, revolver within reach, while Max's ears pricked forward. When he opened the door, standing there was Frank Douglas, an old partner from his years on the Cedar County force. Frank carried a weathered smile, the kind men use to slip past suspicion, but his eyes darted toward the woods before settling back on John. "Heard you had a visitor yesterday," Frank said. "Roy Jackson can't keep his mouth shut. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're holding up." John studied him, feeling the old reflexes stir. Frank had been steady, once a partner who covered his back in tight alleys, but retirement had taught John that time bends men in different ways. He stepped aside and let Frank in, though Max pressed close, a low growl vibrating in his throat. Inside, Frank walked the room slowly, gaze flicking over the photographs of Sarah and Emma on the mantel, then settling briefly on the table before John covered the evidence spread there with a cloth. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence stretched. Finally, Frank leaned back, exhaling. "You know, I always figured if anybody would stumble onto those pictures, it'd be you." John's head snapped up. His voice sharpened. Pictures. Frank froze, realizing what he had said, but it was too late. John's chest tightened. He had told no one about the bundle of photographs hidden in the oak. Not Roy. Not anyone. Yet Frank had spoken of them as if the knowledge were common. He forced his voice calm, masking the storm beneath. "Funny thing to mention. Thing, too. What pictures exactly?" Frank's eyes narrowed just slightly, a flicker of calculation crossing his features. He tried to laugh it off, muttering something about rumors that spread fast in a small county. But the damage was done. John knew now that the circle of those aware of his discovery was larger than he had imagined. Every word exchanged was being measured, weighed, twisted. Max, restless, left John's side and padded toward the front door, barking once sharp and insistent. John excused himself, stepping onto the porch with the dog. Max darted to the edge of the steps, nose pressed beneath the wooden boards of the porch. He scratched fiercely until John knelt beside him. At first, John saw only dirt and cobwebs, but then the faint glint of metal caught his eye. Reaching under, he pulled free a small black device no larger than a lighter, its surface scarred but intact. His breath caught. It was a tracker. Someone had placed it beneath his porch to monitor every movement, every visitor. Every night he thought himself alone. He turned the device in his palm, the weight of betrayal pressing harder than the steel itself. Max barked again, his amber eyes fixed on John as if urging him to see the truth plainly. He pocketed the tracker, steeled himself, and walked back inside where Frank sat nursing coffee. He studied the man who had once been his partner, wondering how much of the old trust remained and how much had been poisoned. Frank talked lightly of the town of shared memories of nothing at all. Yet John heard only the silence between words, the unspoken loyalty to others, not to him. He offered no hint of the tracker in his pocket, only listened with a face trained to betray nothing. As dusk fell, Frank rose to leave, clapping John on the shoulder with forced warmth. "Take care of yourself out here, John. You've got a way of finding things best left buried." His words lingered like frost, even after the sound of his truck faded down the road. John stood in the quiet cabin, Max pressed against his leg, the tracker heavy in his pocket, and the cloth still covering the photographs on the table. His past had sent him allies once, but now those same ties were unraveling into threats. Night settled over the cabin with a stillness so heavy it pressed against the windows. John Carter sat at the kitchen table, revolver within reach, the bundle of photographs sealed in a metal box at his feet, the tracker device lying in the drawer behind him. Max lay by the door, not sleeping but waiting, his chest rising in shallow rhythms, ears twitching at every subtle sound. The events of the past 48 hours had driven John to sharpen every instinct he once carried as a detective. He had locked the doors, checked the windows, even repositioned furniture to create angles of cover. Yet beneath the preparation lingered the knowledge that when the men who had watched from the forest, who had swung an axe into the oak, who had slipped a tracker beneath his porch when they came, it would not be in daylight. It would be in darkness when silence made every footstep louder. Shortly past midnight, Max's head shot up. His growl rumbled deep before John even heard the faint scuff of boots outside. Then came the sharp crack of a lock giving way, the front door bursting inward under brute force. Shadows surged into the cabin, men dressed in dark coats, their movements quick and deliberate. "Where's the evidence?" One barked, his voice low but urgent. John reached for the revolver, but the first intruder was already inside, raising a flashlight toward him. In that split second, Max launched forward, his body a streak of muscle and fury. The shepherd hit the intruder square in the chest teeth, clamping down on the man's arm. The flashlight crashed to the floor, the beam spinning wildly, throwing fractured light across the cabin. The man shouted in pain, struggling to free himself from Max's grip, and in those few seconds John had what he needed. He grabbed the revolver, pulled it up in both hands, and leveled it at the second figure, forcing his way through the doorway. "Stop right there," John commanded, his voice steady with the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. The intruder hesitated, but others pressed in behind him, pushing forward, momentum carrying them inside. The narrow space filled with chaos, shouts, growls, the scrape of boots on wood. John fired once into the ceiling, the crack of the shot echoing through the cabin. Dust rained down from the rafters, the noise halting movement for a heartbeat. Max still held the first intruder, pinned, his growl vibrating through the man's body. In the struggle, something small clattered to the floor near John's feet. He glanced down and froze. A badge lay in the shifting light of the fallen flashlight, its silver surface reflecting brief shards of brightness. He bent his eyes, locking on the engraved letters. Cedar Falls Police Department, Sheriff's insignia. For a moment, time seemed to stop. This was no rogue deputy, no out-of-town thug. This was the badge of Sheriff Robert Hale, a man who had spoken at John's retirement, who had comforted him after Sarah's funeral, who had stood before the community as a pillar of honor. Now his badge lay on the floor of John's cabin, dropped in the middle of a violent raid to seize evidence of murder and corruption. John's chest burned with betrayal sharper than fear. The intruders pressed forward again, one lunging for the revolver, another yanking at Max to tear him off their partner. John shoved back his finger tight on the trigger, the revolver swinging between targets. The fallen badge glinted at his feet, a truth louder than the chaos the conspiracy reached, not just deputies but the very top of the county's law. He shouted over the noise, "You want the evidence. You'll have to kill me for it, and you'll have to get past him first." Max snarled louder, his jaws locked with unbreakable loyalty, blood flecking his coat from the intruder's arm. The standoff froze in place, the cabin air crackling with tension, the truth of the sheriff's betrayal burning like a fire John could no longer contain. The cabin erupted into chaos as the intruders surged forward. John Carter fired once the blast deafening in the confined space, sending one man staggering back. Max released his grip on the first attacker and spun toward another teeth-bared body tense with unyielding courage. In the fractured light from the fallen flashlight, shadows danced like phantoms across the walls. John backed toward the kitchen, revolver raised, his heart pounding with the realization that the sheriff himself was entangled in this dark web. He could hear their demands sharp and relentless. "Give us the photos, Carter, and walk away." But John had seen enough betrayal to know walking away was never an option. Then came the moment that seared itself into memory forever. One of the intruders raised a pistol, its barrel aimed straight at John's chest. He had no cover, no time to react, only the frozen second when he saw the trigger squeeze. Max moved first. The shepherd launched across the room with a force born of instinct and loyalty, throwing himself between the bullet and his master. The gunshot split the air, the crack reverberating through the beams, and the sound was followed by a deep, sickening thud. Max collapsed against John, the weight of his body forcing John to his knees. For an instant, the fight stopped, the room shrinking to only the two of them. John dropped the revolver, his hands desperate as they pressed against the gaping wound in Max's chest. Warm blood soaked his palms, spreading fast. "Stay with me, boy. Stay with me," John whispered, voice breaking his forehead pressed against Max's fur. The shepherd's amber eyes, once fierce and sharp, softened as they locked on John's face. Max's breath came in shallow, trembling gasps, each one weaker than the last. His tail gave the faintest twitch, a final signal of loyalty, as if to say his mission was complete. John's throat tightened until words barely escaped. "You saved me, Max. You always did. You're my good boy." Max blinked once, his gaze unwavering, then slowly closed his eyes as his chest fell still in John's trembling arms. Grief ripped through John like a blade, but fury followed close behind. He looked up at the intruders, his face a mask of grief-hardened resolve. The men saw it too. The detective who had once walked the hardest beats of Cedar County was back, fueled not just by justice, but by the loss of the one creature that had never betrayed him. With a surge of determination, John retrieved his revolver, his aim unshaking. The arrival of sirens in the distance cut through the night, the growing wail of backup closing in. Panic flared in the eyes of the intruders. One bolted toward the door, another scrambled for the badge that had fallen to the floor, but it was too late. Deputies from outside counties and state officers stormed the cabin moments later, weapons raised, voices commanding surrender. In the aftermath, the conspiracy unraveled quickly. Evidence from the oak, the photographs, the revolver with its filed number, and now the sheriff's badge lying on the cabin floor, All of it painted a story no one could deny. Sheriff Robert Hale and his circle of corrupted officials were arrested, their empire of silence and control collapsing under the weight of proof. Weeks later, after the trials and confessions, after the community absorbed the shock that men they had revered were criminals in uniform, the town sought healing. Cedar Falls gathered in the square under the autumn sun to dedicate a new memorial. At the center stood a bronze statue, tall and resolute, capturing Max in mid-stance alert ears, forward body poised to protect. His gaze, forever fixed on the horizon, seemed to watch over the town itself. Beneath the statue, carved into the granite base, were the words that drew tears from the eyes of men and women alike. Loyalty, courage, sacrifice. A hero never dies. Never. John stood at the front of the crowd, his hands clasped before him, his heart aching with both loss and pride. Helen Miller, widow of Daniel, touched his arm gently. He saved you, John, but he saved all of us, too. Without him, the truth might have stayed buried forever. John nodded, unable to speak, his eyes on the bronze shepherd standing eternal. Children placed flowers at the base, and the townsfolk bowed their heads in respect. The betrayal of leaders had scarred them, but the sacrifice of one dog had united them. Max had given his life not just for his master, but for the truth, for justice, for the possibility that Cedar Falls could be rebuilt on something cleaner than lies. That night, John returned to his quiet cabin. The oak still stood scarred but alive, a reminder of the secrets it had once held. The cabin felt emptier without Max's steady presence, yet the silence carried a new weight, not despair, but the memory of loyalty beyond measure. John sat on the porch looking out at the dark tree line. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Max had given everything, and in doing so had restored what corruption tried to steal. The shepherd's legacy would stand forever in bronze, but more importantly, it lived in the hearts of those who now knew the true meaning of loyalty. That was today's story, one of loyalty, betrayal, and the price of truth. Now I want to hear from you. Which moment struck you the most? The hidden badge inside the oak, the shocking betrayal by trusted leaders, or the final sacrifice of a loyal dog? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Your support helps us bring more powerful tales to light.